Welcome, everybody. Feel free to introduce yourselves, name and location in the chat if you'd like people to be able to get in touch with you, provide coordinates if you'd like. We generally don't send out the chat, so if you want to save it, use the 3 buttons in the lower right-hand corner and grab that for yourselves at any time. And I'm going to call this gang to order. Welcome, everybody. This is, gosh, I've lost count. I think this is number 18 of this series that I began in the early days of COVID, early 2020, my gosh, more than 2 years ago now, sort of marveling at the situation of the attention of the world riveted on a single focus and the possibility of coordinated action at speed and scale to deal with a common concern. And as you might imagine, it immediately echoed for me the climate crisis, where we have similar issues, similar challenges, and stunningly similar curves if you look at the trajectories of infections and greenhouse gases and temperatures and heat deaths, and so many things just matched each other as either what at that point looked like exponential, straight up kinds of curves with the J curve that Silicon Valley favors, the S curve that we see in ecological situations of the growth and flattening and sometimes demise of populations. So we began this series of conversations to explore how we might live in this interregnum between a world that is vanishing. That was our declaration at the time, a world that we can no longer take for granted, and an emerging world that's coming, that we're coming to realize, frankly, with both terror and adventure that we can't predict. And the provocation I offered is how do we live in this space between worlds with grace and with dignity and with power, not with helplessness, not with false enthusiasm, not with bravado, and maybe not in the grips of the terror that is so easily available to all of us, even more so now as this year has unfolded. Over the last couple of years, anybody thought they might be able to predict the future, that's pretty clearly off the table now. I've given up the hobby of prediction. I'm not concerned with trying to know what's coming next, but more about how to ready myself for being able to dance with what's coming next, to be effective, to act on the things that I'm committed to, to contribute well to the possibilities that we can hopefully shape and steer a little bit. I've always taken a lot of comfort from Alan Kay's declaration that the best way to predict the future is to create it. So that's sort of the background frame. I'm struck very much lately, a couple of pieces in the New York Times in the last week. One observing that, it's called "The Kids Are Not Okay," looking at the enormous growth of despair and depression in young people today who see no possibility for the future that we are bequeathing to them. Another article a few days later said, young people are angry and in motion and taking on elections and other issues in a significant way. And so you have these polls in a world, frankly, is mostly invisible to me. I don't hang out with young people a lot, to my own detriment. But it seems to me that the ready fall into despair is both because of the way the mediators play the game that they play with us, but also that we have a whole generation that's grown up blind to the history of change. Things that we take for granted that have been in our lived experience, from the civil rights movement to the women's movement to the environmental movement to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which no one anticipated 6 months before it happened. To a single high school student in a not major country who just decided to sit down on Friday afternoons and generated a global groundswell. And we're still stuck and we're still in a mess, but it seems that it's worth looking at the mystery and the history of change. When has it happened? How has it happened? Why? What's involved with that? Where do we see the levers and the points of action in that? So I've invited a guest today, as I did last time. I've invited Josh Harrison, who's here on the screen somewhere. Josh, wave your hand in front of your jungle.
Hi, all.
To join us in a freewheeling conversation. maybe a little bit about despair, a little bit about history and engagement. In particular, as we've been talking about for all these months, about a new engagement, a new human relationship with the world, and the worlds that we bring into being with our words, and how change happens, and how changes happen in the past, and how change might happen in the future. Josh and I have been talking every couple of weeks for the better part of the past year or so, and they're fascinating conversations. So we thought we'd sort of open it up to all of you to hear us go at it for a while, and then open it up to all of us to participate. Just by way of quick background, Josh designs ecosystem adaptation projects and immersive environmental experiences at the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure. I'll put this in the chat. And regenerates cities to function as natural ecosystems through green technology at leafisland.org. So Josh, welcome to the gang. Glad to have you here. Where should we start?
I don't know. I think, hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to join with this group of really remarkable folk who sort of self-organized. And I think I think just the need for contact during the initial stages of COVID. But I think one of the addresses as we sort of move through one world to another is just taking a moment for the remarkable powers of resilience that are unintentional, both at the human level, and I think the example of Greta is absolutely profound. I'm not even sure she was in high school when she started sitting on those steps. She just said, I'm going to take the power of withdrawal and I'm just going to see what that does. And I'm just going to do it for me first. And if it works, then we're all going to go further. And that was completely unexpected and completely transformational. And I think to start on the most optimistic note we can, or at least I can, is I think that process is throughout both human and all other natural systems. There's a power of regeneration that our rational minds can't really fully grasp. And so we don't measure it very well. And we're constantly being surprised by how well it works, whether it's weeds growing in between cracks of concrete. Despite our best efforts to eradicate them, they still sort of emerge. Or whether it's systems that regenerate orders of magnitude more effectively and more powerful than we expect them to when we just get out of the way. So I think even in this moment of absolute triumphant despair, there's a place for respecting the fact that there's a lot of healing that can happen and a lot of growth that can happen if we let it. And I guess that's where I would start.
So getting out of the way is hard for humans, or at least hard for Western humans to do. We're thrown to fixing things. And if you look at one of the tendencies in response to climate crisis is global scale geoengineering. Let's fix it the way we know how to fix things, the way we've broken things in the past, in ways that will, regenerate some of the problems that have brought us to where we are. Mm-hmm. And you have a lot of very smart people, enamored of that agenda. You have a lot of people who have a lot of financial stake in that agenda, enamored of that agenda, but it's very much not letting things alone.
And that's true. I mean, I think it's the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that we've built, Western society in particular has built an economic, political, and social structure that's based on pulling things out of extracting resources and value without any regard towards returning and giving it back and the reciprocal functions that are in any holistic self-grounding system that has to survive. You can't just pull out, you actually have to return. Doesn't matter what kind of system you're talking about, it can't survive without that. And we've built an economic system under the pretense that, that basically cheap energy from 200 million year old, stored solar energy allows us to play the pretense that we can do that. And that's a big problem because, and it's not a new one. I mean, again, the goose that laid the golden egg and the Midas touch are, as old as as Greek mythology allows us to record. So these are stories of human nature that have always been with us, but they've also aren't the only stories we can tell, and they aren't the only. But we do have to, I think, fully address it. I don't think there's any long-term healthy way we get out of the mess we're in and still have the economic system we have. I think that's true.
Yeah, well, you've touched on at least two of the half a dozen or so structural defects of capitalism, capital-ism, that I've been diving deep into lately. We had a call about this last year, videos on the YouTube channel. Folks want to go back to it. But let's step out of that particular mess of concrete and capitalism, come back to the question of change. Everybody knows that change is hard, right? You ever try to change a habit? You know what that's involved. You ever tried to change a loved one's habit? You know that's even more complicated. You try to change the habits of 10 people in a club or 100 people or 100,000 people in a company. There is that. But whenever I think about change being hard, I remember a client of ours years ago, a sustainability officer at a very well-regarded industrial company doing remarkable work within the constraints, Josh, that you're talking about. And they reported to me that as they are, and they brought us in to help them reset an already impressive sustainability strategy at this company. And part of the challenge, as conveyed by the CSO, is that when they talked with people around the organization about what they wanted to do, what they got back was, but it's so hard. With the whining, the whining was conveyed, not just the report of the sound, but the mood that was there of like, why are you asking us to do more stuff? This is so hard to do. Brad is fond of reminding me that rocks are hard. There's a reality, physical reality that you have to deal with. You can't complain about rocks being hard. Rocks are hard. But when a human says something is hard, that's a different kind of action, right? That's their interpretation. That's how they feel in the moment. That's the story that they've constructed about the choices that they're facing. It's a different kind of hard. We know that change happens with takes commitment. It takes practice, not just in the sense of practice like rehearsal, but practices, the things that we do in our lives and in the world. It takes persistence in the face of perhaps inevitable breakdown and resistance. And yet it has happened. So Josh, I'll start with you, but I'll invite other people to comment too on where do you see, let me put it this way, where do you see remarkable change having happened?
Well,
I think your own life and your experience, and let's start to unpack some of those.
Sure. Well, I think that the first question is what to, sort of look a little bit more closely at change and where and how. And I'm increasingly struck, by an old theory out of scientific transformation, which is the idea of paradigm shift. Mm-hmm. That when we're all thinking in a particular way, change is really hard because we've convinced ourselves that this is the way we have to think and this is what we go. And we in this country have a particular beef of what I call the ahistorical present, which is where we are is where we've always been, and why should we, and big things are hard to do, despite the massive history of this country all being about radical transformations happening on a periodic basis.
Could I tweak what you said just a little bit? It's not just that we've convinced ourselves of that, but we've managed to become blind to it.
Right.
We actually can't see things that are right in front of our faces.
Yeah, and I think that's a particular dilemma in the policy field. Mm-hmm. I think most of the policy actors that I deal with on a regular basis just find it inconceivable to make transformations on the level that, in fact, in an odd way, this country has always made. I mean, we transformed our transportation system 3 or 4 times within very short periods of time. We had canals, then we had railroads, then we had all trains, then railroads, then we had cars. I mean, all those transformations were actually relatively quick in a real world time frame, and they were relatively massive in a real world time frame. So the idea that we can't make that kind of a change is like bizarre to me. But I think you're right. It's a self-blinded, self-limited statement on the policy side, which unfortunately brings us back to the political economic constraints. But I'm also more taken with paradigm shift in general, because that's when the requirements that you maintain the status quo stop being requirements. And suddenly things open and things change rather rapidly. I mean, I think crisis is a particular.
Wait, I'm going to stop you, Josh. How do they stop becoming a requirement?
Well, I think that both internal and external factors. I mean, Thomas Kuhn writes extensively about this in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, when he talks about, the old guard and the new guard. And one of his points is sometimes it's the old guard has to die off, but it's basically what happens in his view, and again, it's an incomplete story, but it certainly is suggestive and relative, is there's a series of accepted tenets that get as they stop being a complete answer to the problem they're trying to address, get held on to with ever more rigor by the prime adherents who have all the status in that particular discipline. While the people who are objecting, of course, tend to be newcomers and younger people without evidentiary status in that department. But as soon as something breaks, it's as if that new unknown paradigm has become the dominant one. Think about how Newtonian physics moved over first to Einsteinian and then to quantum mechanics in 30 years. I mean, we go from, we have massive transformations that are rather quick when they happen. And that's one possibility of process that I think is really quite important. And, I think but it doesn't necessarily have to be the old guard has to die to do this. That's sort of a limited, that's an example in the extreme, right? But we have enough people, and basically there has to be enough counterweight to make change possible. And the other one is external crisis. I mean, COVID's the most recent example. We had tremendous mobilization of capital and process and resources in no time at all due to COVID. COVID seemed
without anybody asking, can we afford it?
Without anybody asking, can we afford it? And that's an important piece of the puzzle. We never ask if we can afford war. Mm-hmm. We always assume we can, and we'll figure out how we can.
We don't ask if we can afford infant formula, or healthcare, or housing for people, but we can afford, in blank check for certain things.
Right, and that's a deep social question we have to interrogate ourselves about. Why have we permitted a society and we're a nominally democratic world, at least for the next, till the next election, we're nominally democratic, small d. Why have we permitted ourselves as a collective agency to say, essentially war and self-defense were off the table if we define them those ways, and everything else has to be measured in very, very minute and justifiable portions before we do anything at all.
Okay, so again, I want to get out of the mire of the political process and the political economic process to look at how does change happen? How do either belief systems shift enough or political formations shift enough so the game has changed, as we have seen it happen before. Now, and we could get into a lot of the mire of this year's electoral landscape. I'd like to suggest we not do that for now, but think about, well, let me get into it a little bit. The very visible mood of the Trumpian forces this year was not very visible at this strength 7 years ago. Here it is now, and as an example of profound change in the social landscape in a country. Not instantaneous, 50 years in the making. Sometimes overnight successes reflect a lot of groundwork. Greta maybe just sat down one afternoon, but Rosa Parks didn't just get fed up and sit down on the bus one day in Montgomery. That was part of a years of preparation and training campaign organized out of Highlander Center to develop political strategy, train people in nonviolence, look for a moment in which a precipitating action could happen that then had massive ripple effects that surprised a lot of people. but it was surprised it was carefully produced, like a Broadway show.
Right.
Yeah.
But well, I think that's really a powerful analogy, and I think an appropriate one. And one of the things in that line that we're missing in a large sense, but I think is happening remarkably commonly in a much smaller sense, is that sense of organizing, the sense of the ground roots reorganizing society and moving in it. We've, without getting into the political side, although I don't see how you can talk more completely about these without it.
No, you
I
can't.
think it's moving into those small social organizations. It's re-accepting the fact that change from the ground up and change from the top down are possible when there's common alliance vision to do that, which the civil rights movement was a long, hardworking example of, and which I think the environmental movement has had real difficulty in finding its way towards a really common vision, even though at the surface it's a group, it promotes a vision that many people find quite appealing. Very few people say, I don't want to live on a healthy planet.
Well, let's say hardly anybody.
Hardly anybody. There are a few people.
Yeah, hardly anybody. And hardly anybody goes into their executive suite of their company in the morning saying, my goal is to make the world more toxic and more dangerous today.
However, in that case, the 5 or 6 companies that do that have a lot of sway. And the boardroom of ExxonMobil does exactly that, and has done exactly that since at least 1984, when they fully committed.
Like I said, hardly anybody. But let me put that on the side for a moment. I want to call on Kevin Jones and then Jan Ballard in a moment, because I suspect Kevin, I know at least, is going to speak to this. But I want to recall that New York Times piece this week of a younger generation that maybe has no experience with this kind of organizing, with this kind of process. Maybe the environmental movement doesn't have experience with it either, although environmental voters and a few others, and certainly local grassroots environmental initiatives have some of that aspect in a different way than the national organizations. So, how does that consciousness resurface? Kevin, you've been doing a lot of work at local level, neighborhood economics in particular, and with to my eye, a very keen eye for organizing processes that actually engage and move people. Want to say a little bit?
Well, one thing I've discovered is that most change is a complex contagion in a dense network of people you know and trust, as opposed to a viral thing. So people say, if I could just get people to watch Kiss the Ground, oh my God, it would open their eyes. Well, that's not how it's transferred.
Yeah.
The 50% of the firefighters in our progressive so-called county who didn't get vaccinated did it because they heard from the other 100% who was at the fire station, and so there are these clusters that happen. QAnon does the same thing. We've seen, and I'm researching places where, donut economics can help a group really work within their own bioregion, and seeing how that's working in the UK and multiple places, and some places in Brazil, and we're doing something with it too. And it seems the dense local networks in a place where people care can really do something. As Wendell Berry said, it all turns on affection. You have to care about that place. We're looking to put in several donor advice funds as public utilities, which I can explain, but they need to go to a place where somebody cares about something and wants to make a difference, and they have the right kind of ecosystem. You need a CDFI that's doing small business lending and realizes that it can't reach people. You need various things to be ready for that to work. But dense networks within a local place where people can identify seems to be really something that's working well.
So, Kevin, why has QAnon been so successful at that, and the environmental movement hasn't?
Well, because the environmental movement try to persuade people who aren't in the room, who don't seem to want to do what the environmental movement does, and they imagine these people, and they imagine that they will be changed by this next thing from we as the enlightened environmental people to you as the unenlightened people who don't see it the way we do.
Mhm.
I mean, it's just incredible arrogance, incredible arrogance.
I think we underestimate, Kevin, I think we underestimate that again and again and again. I mean, it is this notion that we're smart, we have good ideas, why don't you accept them, is a really weak organizing tool.
Yeah. But they
And
get stuck in. And the other part is that environmentalists, by their history, are genocidal. And so getting them to care about economic justice is you have to shoehorn it together. We've got a project that links social determinant of health to the health of the watershed, just so that it'll be on their radar as we launch this marketplace. Because they will do huge things about degrowth and all that stuff, and they won't talk about class or race or gender or economic quartile or anything like that. They talked about climates. I have to get these climate people aware of the people downstream that they're polluting on. That's one of the things I'm working on.
yeah, but I think that's a really important.
Now, Joshua, this is really too much of a dialogue of two old white guys, so I will stop. If you want to keep talking, you can. But I'm not going to participate in a back and forth by old white guys when there's a lot of other people in the room. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I got a younger white guy with a hand up, but everybody, please, if you want to speak, put your hands up. I'll take you in order, except if I hop around a little bit. Jan Ballard.
I think it would be great if a female person might talk before me, if anybody wants to. But if not, I'm happy to share. I think your question.
Well, give it. Let's give it a moment.
Yeah.
Give people a chance to reflect and maybe do that if they want.
Yeah.
Marilyn Paul. Hi there. Welcome.
Thank you. I'll just say that I have been in the environmental movement for 50 years. And what I notice, and I would like to hear more about, is what is going to be better for us? How is the world changing for the better? Really, I'm not kidding, for the better than this entrenched, capitalistic, consumer-oriented, isolating, lonely, aggressive culture that we have. What's going to be better when we change the conversation and talk about the really good things that come from environment, taking our climate change seriously?
Well, that's a great tee-in for me. And then I'm sure other people would have things to say to that, Marilyn. The first, I just want to appreciate, Gil, your persistence and hosting this incredible conversation and your question about what real change if we witnessed. And I will just say what's on my heart as I came onto this call today is I got to drive from Virginia to Georgia and Kentucky along the Blue Ridge about a month ago. And I don't know if any of you know the magnificent forests that were on the East Coast, but I have to say I'm still in pain from driving by hours and hours and hours and hours of second growth thrashed forests that have never, I even interacted with a forest ranger because I needed directions, and we just commiserated on the horror of the second growth thing that we've done to our forests. So that's a great example, Josh, of the point you were making about just extract and leave it to itself when it needs to be managed and brought back. The two things that come up to me, Gil, to say in terms of real change that I've seen, I just want to shout out that I've made a living since the mid-'80s as a facilitator of the technology of participation. I would imagine that very few of the people on this call have ever heard of the technology of participation, which we've affected many tens of millions of humans across the planet, brought in the notion of civil society, created the notion and done the professional facilitation profession. The ICA's origin story is that they were founded by a group of chaplains coming out of World War II who saw the Nazis' institutional collaboration with the churches and decided to deconstruct the Christian story. And they ended up targeting the leadership of the Southern churches in the Jim Crow regions. And they trained 50,000 people from 1948 to 1955. And by the early 60s, 100,000 people in religious studies 1. And I had the privilege of actually speaking with Andrew Young, who came to this course with his minister and on Friday night and was stuck there. He didn't even want to go. And Monday night he went to Martin's side and never left his side. So a group of people out of the University of Texas at Austin trained 50,000 people in a training that was so effective that Werner Erhard copied it to use as a structure for the S training. So that's a good example of preparing the ground and going in and having all these leaders in the Southern Black and white churches realize that the church was supporting segregation, and if they stopped, it would go away or it would change. So that's one example that's, affected our country and our world. The other thing is that I have actually done 120 engagements with the holistic accounting that I've invented. And I have watched CEO after CEO after CEO has shared with me, and I have it all in writing in my cases, that they've never seen people change so quickly and so profoundly than when I help them structure their own value creation framework and then start doing measurement games to learn how to apply the scientific method in their daily business life. So I get to witness some of the greatest transformation, sustained transformation in human behavior that I've ever heard about. The Oklahoma Blood Institute, which I worked with in 2007 and 8, still does the conversation. So it is possible in the context of organizations to create an almost overnight transformation and move them into flow by teaching everybody mature measurement skills.
Thank you for that, Jan. And I want to distill a couple of things that I heard from that, and I'll call on David Wilcox and whoever else would like to speak, but please put your hands up. In those conversations, you help people be clear on what they cared about. As part of the inquiry is what matters to
Right.
you, not just the CFO, but the person, the machine operator and the secretary and the janitor. Like, what do you care about?
And the ICA in the Southern churches did the same exact thing. Yep.
So one thing is what do you care about? One is how would you know that we're making progress toward that?
That's right.
How do we pay attention to that in a way that it, in my phrase, gives people a clear line of sight?
That's right.
It connects their actions with the impacts that their actions cause in the world and how those affect the things they care about.
That's right.
But key to all that is actually listening to people, listening to people's cares.
Well, you're reminding me.
Not so much telling them what they should care about, but listening for what they actually do care about, which echoes what you're saying about the early civil rights movement and what Kevin's been saying about the complex interconnections, not the viral and distant interconnections. Let me move on.
Can I just make one comment before we move off? Just that I had the privilege of having lunch with Doug Engelbart on a monthly basis in the last couple of years of his life, and he developed the bootstrap triple loop learning and everything we do with computers. And in some of our last conversations, I said, Doug, I've really looked at everything you've done, and I think that what you missed was the fourth loop of measurement. You didn't build into bootstrapping how people could know whether they'd made progress. And he agreed that was probably the way to get bootstrapping into a quadruple loop. So the key is what do we care about? And then if we're trying to change something, how do we actually all know whether it's changing? And thank you for doing this, and I appreciate everybody's listening.
Yep. I've got something to add, but I don't want to make David wait anymore. Let's come to you and I'll maybe loop back. David Wilcox, welcome.
This is my first time on this call, and I am glad I joined. I've sent invites to a few people. Mm-hmm. Hope that they don't mind. I often end up working on things that I don't know much about. And I've spent the last month essentially trying to understand how many organizations are working on our political challenges. And so despite the fact we want to move away from them. I can't.
Yeah.
We've found over 100 organizations specifically targeted directly on those challenges. We found over 100 organizations that are bigger organizations that deal with that, among a host of other things. Over 100 organizations that are uniquely using a particular ecosystem, universities, training centers, variety of others that I'm sure you can think of, to attack the problem from different angles. And then another 100 organizations plus that are essentially trying to help those 300 organizations be successful. And none of these include the consultants. These are all dedicated organizations, not the consultants who are advising them. So I guess when we talk about change, the problem is every one of these organizations is populated with change experts, not just above average. The people you would actually ask to facilitate a meeting are the leaders of these organizations. So, it begs the question, what are we just blind to relative to making anything actually happen? There have been, I think, 15 attempts at what are called grand bargains. I'm sure this audience knows of several of them that we don't know of, but what was learned from trying to do those was that that's kind of one of the only approaches that might work. And yet none of these organizations are working on that approach, even though among the possible approaches, that would be in the top 3 of ones that might work. And yet you're talking about 400 organizations that aren't zero are
David,
working on that particular problem approach.
David, what would be an example of a grand bargain so we can just calibrate that to our experience?
So very simply, you have to solve multiple problems at the same time.
Mhm.
You have to exclude the problems that neither extreme will ever accept.
Mhm.
So mainly economic or economically related problems end up being in the 6. So healthcare, climate change, taxation would be 3 of the 6. And then you have to propose a set of trade-offs to the total audience that they can actually make. They can say, I agree to give up that in order to get this. And then in our political system, we'd have to throw out all the extreme members and vote in the whole grand bargain.
Okay, so that's the how of it, but give me an example of a couple that have been successful.
The Senate had a gang of 6 that developed a grand bargain. I can't remember who was president, and then Clinton had a grand bargain sustainability. He didn't call it that, but it was called the Clinton Sustainability Initiative. And they had maybe 24 people who worked on a grand bargain during the Clinton administration. And they actually brought the solution to the congressman, and the congressman said they wouldn't vote for it.
Okay, so that doesn't sound like a success story exactly. Let me go on to Ken Homer. We'll maybe loop back on this.
But at least it had the potential to solve multiple problems. It hasn't been successful politically.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on you. You said this is the only thing that works, and I've asked you twice, and you haven't given me one example of.
No, I said it's one of the possibilities, one of the top 3 possibilities.
Okay.
If it worked, it'd be done.
Thank you. Okay. Ken Homer.
Hello, everybody. Gil, it's nice to be here again. I think we're due for another walk soon. I'm thinking about this, when you asked how does change happen, I think we need a more specificity around that question, because how does change happen at the individual level, at the family level, community level, and what our friend Pete Kaminsky calls the hyperscale level are all very different. When we're talking about really large systems, change is very different than when we're talking about individuals. So I just want to throw that out there. And I wanted to tell a really short story that had a change that helped me to change. Part of what helps people change is seeing things from another perspective. And oftentimes when there's a blockage, where, what's the old saying? It's difficult to get someone to see your perspective. Their paycheck depends on them not seeing it. So how do we tell stories that get this in? So the brief story is, there's a man who's very hungry and he's walking down the street. He hasn't eaten in quite a while. And he walks past this restaurant. He smells these amazing aromas coming out. And he sees a sign that says, all you can eat, your grandchildren will pay the bill. And he goes in, and there's these huge tables filled with all kinds of foods, everything you could possibly think of. And the waiter comes over and says, here, take a plate and help yourself. And he loads up 3 times, and they come by with the dessert cart, and he has amazing desserts, and they bring him coffee and port, and he's like stuffed. And he gets up and starts for the door, and the waiter comes over and says, excuse me, sir, your bill. And he says, no, there's some mistake. It says that my grandchildren will pay the bill. He says, that is correct, sir. This is the bill for your grandparents. And I think that we live in a world where we don't recognize we're paying the bill for our grandparents. And when we can start to have that shift in our temporal perspective, that we are not here as us, we are here as part of the continuation of humanity that goes back millions of years, and hopefully will go forward millions of years. When we start to think in those terms, we might start to see some of the kind of change that we're talking about.
We used to.
We did used to.
For most of human history, we used to. Maybe in the last, I don't know, couple of 100 years. Some people know better than me what the time frame on this is. We stopped doing that.
I would say in my lifetime, actually, it really shifted big time. So there's always been a thread of that, but a thread's been there, but in the last 60 years, there's been a really big shift towards narcissism.
Big time in your lifetime and mine, big time in the last 50 years, when Milton Friedman told us all that the purpose of business is to maximize profit. And that became short-term profit. And then we're in the trap that we're in, where you can be sued if you don't do this. But it's not just the mechanisms of capitalism, it's the mindset that has produced in all of us, which is that the future doesn't matter. Ken posted in the chat a link to a fascinating interview in the New York Times with Václav Smil, about his book called How the World Really Works. And I really encourage people to have a look at it. It's rich and provocative, and I disagree with some of the things in it, and I'm chastened by some of the things in it. But one of the things he observes is that you look at the complexity of the climate challenge and what we need to do that we're not doing fast enough for many different reasons. Even if we did everything fast enough now, the benefit is 50 years out. It's people in 2070 who are going to benefit. So are we going to invest now for the benefit of people in 2070? What bill are they going to pay from the meal that we ate?
All right. And for anyone who doesn't have access to New York Times, email me, kenhomer@sonic.net. I will send you the article. I have it in email ready to go, so you can read the whole thing. And we can, if there's time, we'll come back and talk about some of the more pieces of that. But that's one that stands out very dramatically. He's challenging us to get real on the complexity of change, on just how much has to move, at what scale, how quickly, in order to realize the possibilities that we want to get to. Marilyn, back to you.
I just want to say that the story that we are sacrificing now, things that we really want, so that 50 years from now, someone's going to benefit, is not very persuasive. My question is, and David Gershon talks about this in his Cool Cities project, what can we get now for us that makes our lives better? For example, Gershon talks about we connect with neighbors, we feel less lonely, maybe we work through our aggressive consumerism, maybe we find that life is better when we walk or take the bus. Why? Because we're more in touch with our locality. If we cannot tell a story about why life will improve today, we're not going to do it. Unless, please tell me I'm absolutely wrong, that everyone will make lots of sacrifices for the world 50 years from now. And I can tell you how my life has improved by engaging politically in my local, in Berkeley, how walking rather than driving actually improves my life, how eating more sustainably, more plants, being more aware, I feel like that has drastically improved my life. But I'm not, so more of us need to tell those stories more often rather than getting the tisk, you're driving a big gas guzzler, you're ruining the life. This narrative must change, in my view.
Have a great time.
It must, and
See you
it's
later.
even weirder than that,
Be
Marilyn,
safe.
because there seems to be this. Could people mute if you're not speaking, please? Thank you. There seems to be this weird perspective on what I'll loosely call the environmental left, that sacrifice is good and noble. And the more you sacrifice, the better person you are. And if you're not willing to sacrifice, you're not as good a person. And that song doesn't play with a lot of people who see themselves as not having enough of what they need. And as you say, it's not necessary because a lot is better. I mean, in my work with businesses, I'm confronting again and again executives. We talked about this last month. Executives who say we can't afford to do sustainability when in fact they will be much more economically successful if they commit their company to the future and the living world and the well-being of all people. There's actually more money to be made than not. But the belief system is that it's either do good or do well. It's either now or the future. It's either me or you. And yet, I think you put your finger on something right at the heart of the matter.
And the other thing is, for example, something very right in front of us, cut back on food waste. The average American family can save $2,000 a year. How do you cut back on food waste? You have to be more conscious of the food you put on your plate. You have to be more conscious when you shop for food. You can't just keep tossing out that arugula that you never get to. But that's good. It actually improves the quality of your life. And you save $2,000 a year, which in 10 years is $20,000. But that conversation, again, is not very visible.
And Marilyn, for those of you who don't know, writes books about these kinds of things. So check her out. Thank you, Marilyn. I'm going to go to Doc Hall, and then Kevin Jones, and then whoever raises their hand next. Doc, over to you.
Yeah, listened to this with interest, and I see a pretty good split even in the environmental community. There are a good many who think that if we make a few technical adjustments, life can go on much as we have had it. And I doubt that, because we're just not that smart. And we see that time after time. And the depth of the change to go through is considerable if we're going to do something else. Marilyn, I think, hit it pretty well. That this is being satisfied with something other than more and more consumption being the key to enjoying life. And I'm a little bit hopeful on this because I see a number of young people that are rejecting that. Not going to work 2 jobs for some future that isn't really there. I would like to have a life right now, not way out there somewhere where maybe I could get a home and whatever, do the American dream. And that's what makes me a little bit hopeful that a truly different kind of future life enjoyment is possible to convey to people. I think the situation is ripening to do that.
Thank you. Kevin. Kevin Jones, sorry, it's a gray beard following a gray beard, but that's the
My
sequence.
message is to Doc Hall, the giant green tomato behind you seems to be getting closer. The thing behind you seems to be getting closer as you talk. I think it's moving your way. You should watch out for that thing.
You're on mute, Doc.
Doc, if you're responding, we can't hear you.
I'll try not to let the thing overwhelm me. That's just a green screen behind me. Fuzzed up.
That's all I had to say.
Okay, thank you. Anybody who hasn't spoken yet? Brad?
Yeah, I've been loving reading all the comments, by the way. And just again, when it comes to change and everything that we've all said, unless somebody can convince me otherwise, I firmly believe that all change has to start with the individual. You can't change a family unless the mom, and I'm assuming the mom, dad, and kids, okay? Forgive me for going conventional, but I'll just call that a family for the moment. Unless the mom, the dad, and the children individually all agree that they're going to change, I don't think the family dynamics will change. The father can insist, the mother can punish, the kids can revolt, but the dynamics of the family, at least from observation, from what I've seen, can't change as a family unit unless all the individuals change. Take that up to the next level, say a community. Unless individual people go and vote to put somebody else in office or vote for a particular law, the law doesn't get passed, the new person doesn't get elected,
So,
and everything stays the same. So I keep coming back to, it's up to each one of us individually to do whatever we can on whatever level we choose to do it on. But if we don't individually change, I don't have a whole lot of faith that things are going to change or systems are going to change. Changing systems to me is about changing individuals first. And when you have enough individuals that change, a system can change.
yeah, well, the individuals are changing in conversation with other individuals. By the way, I hate the word individuals. Somewhere along the line in my lifetime, we stopped calling people people and started calling them individuals, but that's a rant for another time. Lisa Friedman and then David Grossoff.
Hi. So there were some other things I was thinking about, but just in terms of individuals, I think we're in a consumer culture and we have just experts marketing to us and selling us ideas. So to say that we want what we just thought of independently. So did I really need to do everything on a device like this before somebody made it for me, made it easy, made it beautiful, made it stores where I could get it? So I think there's a lot of things where if you want individuals to change, you can get them to change, like in cool cities. I put up some information about that, which get people on blocks together and people get to know their neighbors. I'm on Zoom with people from all over the world often during my workday. I actually don't know every single person on my block. So that's been interesting to try to go to know the people on the block and start to change together.
Lisa, hold the thought for a second. How many people here know their neighbors and know the people on their block?
All of them. Like I know most of them.
How many people share your work and your concerns and your organizing activities with the people on your block?
Every single neighbor.
No, I'm not asking just you. I'm asking all of us. It's, there's an opportunity there, right? This is the stuff Kevin Jones was talking about back at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right?
So that was one end of the spectrum about the individuals, but then also how do you get individuals to want a certain thing? The other side of the spectrum that I've seen recently was been reading a book by Peter Fikowski, who has wrote a book called, I'm on Blur, so I don't think you'll be able to see it. But anyway, it's it basically says climate restoration.
Mhm.
And he has a foundation for climate restoration, so a nonprofit. And what was interesting about it was he's looking at, so there are things that individuals need to do, but what are the big things that if our problem with climate is we need to get carbon and carbon equivalents, we need to draw them down out of the atmosphere. And he makes it simple. Like he would say, it's 1 trillion tons, which I find easier for most people to understand than 1,000 gigatons, right? So we have 1,000 gigatons in the carbon up there. 1,000 doesn't sound like so much. What's a gigaton? But if you say it's 1 trillion tons, more people kind of understand what a ton is. So that it's just, you go, okay, here's the number. This is what we have to get out. Here's the date we have to get it out by. And he shows the research on what are the 4 most at scale and cost-effective ways to get that carbon out, and lists those 4 ways and says if we at least started while people are working from the bottom up, neighbor to neighbor to neighbor, about what our emissions are, what about the people who are kind of drawing down the carbon at the same time, which are going to be the ones that save us, because we're already having problems now with the carbon that's up there. So it's things like iron fertilization in the ocean that gets microalgae, and then they're the phytoplankton that draw down the oxygen. I mean, that draw down CO2 and give off oxygen. How to get synthetic limestone to draw down the carbon and put it into limestone. So all the new ways of concrete, and the numbers on how much concrete gets used every year is stunning. So if we had that concrete all be carbon negative, something around seaweed permaculture, how to get seaweed farms out in the open oceans, and then methane oxidation. And he really describes each one and makes it logical. So I like the bottom up, that people are working bottom up, and then in cities, and then people who are doing the research to say, how do we get these big initiatives funded for drawdown? So that's.
Thank you for that. Strikingly missing from his list is soils. And I point people to the work of Walter Yenny out of Australia. I'll put his name in the chat, who says that the fact that we've denuded 40% of the land area of this planet from vegetation and lost the ability of plants to take in carbon dioxide, fix it into the soil, have a soil that has a sponge that can hold water and affect the water balance of the planet. Water being a more significant greenhouse influence than carbon dioxide is hugely important and overlooked. But then the question is, how do we impact that? How do we as individuals impact the big game? Slim, in that New York Times article, points out that the world runs on 4 major materials. He's a big guy around material flows, and he says if you look at the material flows that sustain this world, he says cement, steel, plastic, and ammonia. Interestingly, he doesn't have petroleum on the list. I do not know why. That's maybe a defect in his game. But then he looks at the trend among environmentalists, maybe people on this call here who are eating less meat, but who are happy to get on a plane to fly to a conference. And each of us makes the accommodations and makes the choices and chooses our priorities, but with little understanding of where the net impact is. The funny thing is that meat may not be the issue if you have a kind of agriculture that's designed to build soil and sequester carbon and raise cattle in a way that cattle are meant to live. So, we can spend a lot of time at the big policy and strategy level. Again, I want to bring us back to the question of how change happens, how we have changed, how we influence change. And with that, perhaps I'm going to toss the mic to David Grossoff.
Thanks. I don't have any great expertise about environmental movements, but I think I can talk about applying history in the discussion of issues with a lot of scientific and technological complexity, where there are these credentialed experts. Earlier, you were talking about how environmentalists come across. And I was much reminded of the chapter in history that I know best, which is the efforts by atomic scientists, mostly in the United States, but really forming an international community after World War II to say, we really have to control fissile materials. It's quite possible now, it won't be possible later, and it's an existential threat to humanity. And in the United States, and to a lesser extent in the United Kingdom, because the physicists didn't understand that their first job was to be trusted and to understand what their audience thought of them, they thought their job was education, not persuasion. And attacks on their goodwill or claiming they're a bunch of garlic breath, egghead, intellectual foreigners who don't know what the real world is like, et cetera, was enough to reduce their influence substantially. And they were so clueless that in the magazine that they used to talk to themselves, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, it wasn't until 1950 that someone even raised the question of why they weren't being trusted, and that being trusted was a crucial issue. And that wasn't even written by one of these very, very, very smart eager to help save the world physicists. And I think there's anytime anyone, so as a result of my study of this, anytime I hear anyone talk about education, I correct them. I'm rude and I interrupt and I say, do you mean persuade? And it's a different attitude just to frame it as a job of citizen to citizen persuasion rather than expert to, plebeian communication. And there are other episodes in the history of technology controversies that can be brought to bear, but I really wanted to sort of bluntly state that point with a hammer.
It's a good one, and it's a step in the right direction, David. Moving from education to persuasion, better. Both of them presume that human beings are rational creatures and that you can persuade people with logic, which I would argue is not true. But Gandhi once said that all persuasion is violence. And maybe the challenge isn't so much to persuade people, but back to what Marilyn had said and Kevin had said, and some of you had said in various ways. Maybe the challenge is to actually listen to people, and to learn what people care about, and then find where the things that we care about are in common, and where we can find common purpose around something that maybe then grows into something else, and maybe into something else.
Gil, because the Negro Civil Rights Movement is so important to you and to many others here as a sort of exemplary for a pretty successful social movement, there was no one organization that had all the right answers and had all the right ways for people to participate. Has anyone, the political scientists asked me this a couple of years ago, is there kind of a map of different organizations and how they interact? Because now there's so much interesting Negro civil rights history, like the documentary, The Strange Death of Jim Crow about Houston, which was not a major area for civil rights, where you had Black businessmen working behind the scenes with young guys who were, and women who were willing to get arrested and put their bodies on the line. So you had people organized around how much risk they had, how much resources they had, identifying opportunities, tactically communicating, having organs of communication that could be trusted, and sort of, a map of a movement is potentially very useful.
Short answer is that, as far as I know, there are lots of maps. There are some map makers here on the call with us. There are, dozens and dozens of maps. Some people's maps are fancy pieces of software. Some of them are note cards and strings on walls.
Okay.
The process that Kevin Jones described, I don't know if he's still with us on the call, is a kind of map making, although the people doing it probably wouldn't call it map making, but it's looking at who knows whom. And what are the relationships, and how do I get to that person through personal connection? And how do we bring people together who either know each other or share someone trusted in common? These are all kinds of map making, although it's not like, it's not like movable connected dots on a screen. But yeah, I think that's part of how we operate as human beings. I'm glad that you raised it. Thank you. Let me go to Dawn and then back over to Jan, unless we have a new hand coming up. Dawn, the mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So in my community, which is a college town and a county seat, we have a small organization called Green Team. And the last 3 or 4 years, we've been converting lawns to meadows, planting fruit trees, and bringing a consciousness to the community about growing food and vegetables and beautifying rather than doing the lawn thing. So this year, starting on Saturday, this very weekend coming up, we're having a porch fest. And what that is that it's a 4-block area where people are opening up their porches to performers. There are 20 groups coming to play music and just celebrate. And it originated out of someone saying to one of the founders of the Green Team, oh, environmental, stuff, it's so depressing, Dead Sea turtles and climate change. Those events are always so depressing. And so we are inviting people to have a good time, to bring happiness and community. We don't have to discuss anything. We can just be together. And music brings people together.
Yeah.
You know, I offer that as a suggestion for building a whole new, different kind of environmental consciousness.
So it may be the change comes out of relationship.
Yes. And fun, happiness and fun and celebration of the beauty of nature and the fun of music.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jan Ballard.
Yeah, just a couple comments of things. One, how many people on the line, or I don't know, maybe I can't do a poll, but have people heard about the Adult Childhood Experiences Index? It's called the ACEs Index. It's a single page with 10 experiences that when humans have it by the age of 6, the experiences color every day of the rest of their lives. And there's a movement happening in the United States. There's a film about it. And the American College of Pediatricians has now recommended, because there's a whole generation of children who are not recovering from illness as fast as adults. And they've discovered that if you have more than 3 of these 10 on the ACEs index, it tends to have a big effect on health outcomes. And so all the pediatricians are being encouraged to ask every child they treat, which of these 10 experiences have you had? And it's leading to a whole movement of families sharing trauma histories as a way of becoming more intimate and more connected and understanding each other better. So I encourage you all to just look up ACEs Index and download the single page. My girlfriend is a 9. I'm a 0. You can imagine what that's like for us. The other thing I want to just mention is that the drought in California, in the Central Valley, most likely is being caused by something called cheatgrass, which is covering millions of acres in the foothills on both sides. It's that brown grass that lights up into flame and goes into infernos instantly. That's an invasive species that has about an inch of stuff on the surface. And the reason California is in a drought is because every drop of rain that falls on that stuff is absorbed and none of it gets in the soil. So all the rain that's falling on California and millions of acres is not going into the soil. It's being absorbed and it's going into that tall burning stuff. So
Jan,
that's just an example.
Let me ask you to put a reference for that in the chat.
Okay.
My people tell me a very different story about drought in California. So let's see some documentation for that interpretation.
I will send you the deck with the data.
If you look at the climate history of California over the last 150 years, you see that there's a regular cycle of rain and not rain on a 3 to 7 to 10 year cycle. So part of what we call drought is that.
No, there's no question. It's all contributing factors. But the sponge of the earth, accepting the drops that come onto the ground and not letting them go anywhere, like the Marine Carbon Project proved, that is the key to restoring the water. And the Waterman of India just restored 7 rivers in the last 25 years simply by making sure that the rain that falls, no matter how small it is, doesn't go off the property. It stays right where it falls. And in a place.
The Key Line Plan in Australia, same thing. And this is what Walter Yenny's work is pointing to as well.
Yes, yes, exactly.
The other important.
Those are my 2 things.
The other important piece about the drought in California, my friend Will Sarney, who's a water expert, likes to grab people by the lapel and shake them and say, don't call this a drought. Jet Propulsion Laboratory calls it a multi-decadal mega drought. This is not the historical 3 to 5 year cycle. This is a massive shift in the hydrological regimes of the planet, which is why it's so serious.
Which can be immediately reversed by enhancing soil biota levels in meadows and forests. You start afforestation and the rain comes back within 24 to 36 months in some cases. So
forests call in the rain.
That's right.
Forests don't arise where there is rain. Forests generate rain.
That's right.
And this is a very different kind of game than geoengineering.
Yep.
This is kind of where we started, actually, Gil. This is getting out of the way of natural systems and supporting them and increasing them. And this is sort of treating, the world. And I think this talks to a system and a theory of change
Yes.
that we've been hinting about, which is if we stay in the human community as our highest end goal, we're limiting our success of actually being a long-term
That's right.
survivor on this planet. We're one of 12 million species. We're only one of them. There may be 6 million by the time we're done with this particular thing, but they'll all come back. For us to be part of that long-term process, we need to think of not ourselves, but like other natural systems do, but how we contribute to the whole, and then how we benefit from being in that contributory state. And that allows us to have social justice, economic justice, human organizations, all of which in the context of place-based work, of bioregional economics, of letting the donut effect work. And I think that that's how we change. That's one of the ways that we change our perspective on how we get to these conversations about change, which are both, I believe, firmly on the ground down, as well as the top but ground up and the top down. They both have to be in real play. But I think that transformation can happen much more quickly and much more optimistically if we let ourselves let it happen. And if we all say, and we can do that, as I think some people have said very effectively, we can do that joyfully. We can do that joyously. We can do that living well and with well-being if we let ourselves define well-being as what we feel, not what we're told to feel by the economic advertising around us.
There you go. Well said. And the 12 million or so of all of us species together have among us, 4 billion years of R&D about how to have systems work well.
Right. And the most effective, most powerful climate regulation technology that exists is photosynthesis. It's 420 million years old. It's been field tested, let's say, at every single square centimeter of the planet, and I think we presume quite arrogantly that we have better systems in place, when in fact, we should defer to what works as opposed to trying to invent what's new.
So Josh, could you give folks a kind of 3-minute overview of how you're attempting to do that in New York City?
All right. Well, I basically the key insight of what we're trying to do in Leaf Island is to recognize that you can bring the built environment back to the ambient temperatures that existed before those buildings existed by adding the equivalent amount of complex leafy green cover to the roofs, existing roofs, sidewalls, and streetscapes and water's edge of a city that existed in density before those buildings were actually placed on the landscape. And you can do that by adding the sufficient plant cover. And when you do that, you bring your temperatures back to below ambient. So you can locally change your environment right now within 3 to 5 years, because it takes, you can do it at a cost that's not prohibitive. It's not trivial, but it's not prohibitive. And you don't need to cover every square inch to do that. In New York City, it may be 25%. And why? Because New York City is a vertical space. So you may have 300 acres of flat land, but you've got 300 square miles of flat land, but you have 3,000 square miles of wall space.
And
so
you do this, you save water, you save energy, you enhance
you
beauty.
reduce local heat environment, you do all these things. And what you're doing is you're essentially treating skyscrapers like newly formed mountains. And you're then assisting natural processes by bringing the vegetation back to the mountains instead of a 30 million year cycle or a 1 million year cycle in the case of, the biggest example of this is Hawaii, which 1 million years ago was volcanic rock and now is what everybody knows what it is. So the Big Island is the best example of that. So that's what we're doing in New York City. We're starting with the New York City Parks Department and about 1.5 million square feet of municipal roofs that need to go green.
Great. Thanks, Josh. George Mokry, and then Stuart Levine.
Couple of ideas. I guess I've been completely nonviolent because I've not persuaded anybody about them. For about 10 years, I produced a weekly that was for free, and it covered what happened in the community and in the universities in that town called Boston. And there was a lot that was going on. It was all about energy and climate and foreign affairs and all of these kinds of things. And I was covering this. And for 10 years, I could never get the environmental community to buy into that, with the exception of EDF. With the pandemic, what I found was that I could take this international because everything was online. It's a little bit less than that now. And I stopped doing it for about 1.5 to 2 years because I burned out and I didn't see any response. I do it now as a monthly, hubevents.blogspot.com, if anybody is interested. We could do a global compendium of university and community climate and energy information that would speed the information flow around the world and maybe allow collaboration. But I don't know anybody who's actually interested in that. Another thing, another idea which has gone nowhere. For 20 years, I've been saying solar is civil defense. And by that, I mean a couple of inches of PV panel can power the light, the communications, either by cell phone or radio or walkie-talkie, and charge small battery supposed to have on hand in case of emergency, the next weather emergency. You can do this for $7, $25 retail. This is also entry-level electricity for the 1 billion or so people who don't have access now. I was surprised reading a decade ago a BBC story about a woman in Africa who was bicycling 20 miles per day in order to charge her cell phone. And I went, this is crazy. If she has a charger on her bike, she could bike 5 miles, or 3 miles, whatever she usually does, except going 20 miles to get her cell phone charged. So in the course of her daily biking, she could charge her bike without doing that 20-mile trip. I don't know anybody who's been able to monetize that or make that into a product, although I know that there are a couple of people who have tried to do that.
Let me suggest that you don't know anybody who's done that doesn't mean that it's not happening.
Exactly. And that's why I say I don't know anybody who's done that. But I follow this stuff and I haven't seen it.
Okay.
If you can point me in the direction, I'd be happy to.
Well, there are people on this call maybe who can. Dr. Google can be helpful. I really just want to shift the mood of the conversation, George, that I'm hearing from you, which is I'm less interested in the recounting of all the good ideas that haven't happened because there are always an infinite number of them. I'm more interested in what has them happen and what actions can be taken to move them. And, and what can we all, the crux is what can we all do differently? It's very easy to say that, oh, those people over there haven't taken up the good ideas.
Well, that's why, I'm bringing these things up. Because eminently practical and feasible, and I present them to this group to see whether anybody else is interested in doing it.
And I'm inviting you to be a little bit more direct about exactly that, about making an invitation, making a request, asking for what you need, inviting collaboration. Much more powerful than the story about, oh, this hasn't happened or I haven't heard that it's happened. Because there's an infinite amount of stuff that hasn't happened. And our job isn't cataloging that, it's taking the things that we care about and helping them move forward. So thank you.
Let me make my point. Let me make one point before I leave.
But before you leave, please put that URL in the chat so people can track you down.
Okay. The thing is that I've been doing this for a long time. These are slight shifts, but it's difficult to make the change. As I put in the comment, Eric Hoffer in The Ordeal of Change begins the book by talking about being a farm worker and picking peas one day and then knowing the next day he's going to have to pick beans, and laying awake at night in his bunk because he's afraid of what that difference is, that ordeal of change. To think about small changes is as difficult as thinking about large changes. And often it's those small changes can make real differences, but they're ignored because they're small.
George, I want to respond, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying this to pick on you. This is for generally, this is for all of us, because you're speaking something that is in the world, in the culture with us. It's just not to you personally. But I'm going to ask the question to you, which is, what sort of mood do you imagine you're generating in this group by sharing that story?
My purpose in sharing
No. I'm not asking your purpose. I'm asking, what kind of mood do you think the storytelling is generating?
nonviolence, because I'm not persuading any.
Okay, but are people attracted? Are people energized? Are people moved to action? Are people drawn into collaboration with you? You don't need to answer, but these, in all of our conversations, we are interacting at the level of moods with each other, both the moods that we're in and the moods that we're generating with other people. And that's something to notice in our communication and think about what we want to generate, what kind of invitation we want to be that has people say, you know, I really want to work with you on that. I'm excited, I'm stimulated, I'm provoked. I want to know more about that. And that's part of our challenge. It's not to have the right answer or to have all the facts or to have the list of the 3 best strategies or, you know, the economic analysis of the whatever, but to engage other human beings into a relationship of enthusiasm and collaboration and wanting to do something. I'm not going to disagree with Eric Hoffer, and there's a lot of people who say that change is difficult. I think I said something like that at the start of the call, but let's be clear that that's an interpretation. We make interpretations about the world. This is not, it's not like a rocks is hard thing. It's like a it's like a personal interpretation of what things are like, how I will see the world and how I will act in the world based on those interpretations that I've constructed out of my life experience, my history, my culture, my relationships, how I got out of the bed this morning, what was on the news 2 hours ago. But all that is malleable. Rocks are hard, water is wet, humans are fluid. Human relationships and the conversations we have with each other is where the work happens. George, thank you for indulging me. Stuart and David, and then we're going to need to wrap up.
Thanks, Gil. Sure, just a few thoughts. One, and I really appreciate your remarks, Joshua, about what's going on in New York. It sounds to me like we know a lot of what to do. We know a lot of what to do, but we're not doing it. It goes back to individual change in some sense. Somebody mentioned that, I think it may have been Ken. The idea of the Buddhist concept of beginner's mind, people starting to see change as a process. And at the beginning of the call, Gil, I think you asked for, so who has seen change? Mm-hmm. Who has seen effective change? And 3 things popped up in my mind. Number 1, migrants going to another culture. And the ability of human beings to adapt, you know, in 1 generation fairly quickly and move into that new culture and completely change their way of being from what they knew. Part of what's in the way may be democracy. Democracy is messy and it's slow. When I think of massive change, I think of 2 other examples in my lifetime, Israel being one. You know, a democratic government and the level of transformation extraordinary, and China being the other one, more of an autocratic government, but the level of change has been just extraordinary. So at some level, it may be that we need something much more catastrophic than a pandemic to pull us forward with a new vision of the future that will get people to act and change. I don't know the answer. I'm trying to, in some sense, write my way or think my way through this. But we do know what some of the huge answers are, and it's great. It's enlivening to hear what's possible scientifically and how much people know scientifically about the things that we could do to make this happen.
Yeah, you'd never know in the mainstream media how much enormously creative and thrilling work is going on all over the planet. There's that. David. Whoops.
You'll see a number of links to systems change papers that I dropped in.
Okay.
Most of you have not read them because most of them have not been read by hardly anyone, even though they were published by the leading organizations in the social innovation space.
Well, that might be diagnostic of something.
No, I think it is diagnostic. And I'll say very simply, my conclusion, having read them and looking at what's happened, is that reading, publications, and even conversations no longer work. When you come to someone who can actually influence the outcome for the earth, their understanding of the complexity means you make yourself irrelevant when you suggest to them that a conversation in a white paper could fix this. It's just not possible. I dropped in Servest Earth, done by a person I respect greatly, a millennial, who's approaching the problem from a millennial's viewpoint. And it's the kind of thing that a CEO will look at and say, that's actually a credible thing for you to put in front of me and my team, for us to be able to actually analyze the risks to our actual business operations across, I think they have something like 200 million assets in the database already, and then the company can add their own assets. So that's the level of complexity that you have to deliver a possible tool to someone who can change.
I'm going to interpret it slightly differently. That's an
Please.
example of listening to what your counterpart really cares about and sharing your gifts with them in a form that they can hear. Much more important than sharing it in the way that you like or are familiar with or habituated to. So it's a great example of that in a very complex situation. Same thing happens in more simple situations. So thank you for that. Josh, last word from you, and then I'll have one brief thing to say in closing.
Well, I think this has been a really stimulating and provocative conversation with a lot of wonderful thinking and ideas, and a lot of access to the frustration many of us feel between what we feel needs to happen and where we are, but also some options to move forward. I think so. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this, and I think this is one of the paths forward is to keep beating around the bushes until we get to where we need to get to.
Thanks for being with us. Reminder to everybody, we have these calls every third Wednesday, noon Pacific time. You can pre-register out ahead for those. Please, if you found this valuable, please invite other people. A number of people comment on the limited diversity of the group we have here. It depends on you all, as well as me, to expand the diversity. So please invite other people who you think might be interested, who are not like you and not like me. And let's broaden this conversation as best we can. The video will be posted to my YouTube channel in the next couple of days. The chat is yours to download using the 3 dots in the lower right. Those of you who can't access it, let us know. We'll get it to you. Thank you, Ken, for volunteering on that. And just a last word, coming back to some of what we talked about in the beginning of the conversation. I've been very influenced by the work of J.M. Juran, not a well-known name. People know the name W. Edwards Deming, more likely the originator of total quality management. Juran was a colleague in that, or counterpart in that work. And Juran said, gosh, 75 years ago, said that people are always being challenged what they do or don't do and what are they in control of in the workplace. This was focused on the workplace. He said, to be in a state of self-control, a person needs to have three things. They need to know what's expected of them. They need to know how well they're doing at delivering what's expected of them. And they need to know what resources are available to do differently, if that's what's called for. Okay, three things. Called J1.
Gil, could you say that again? You blipped out.
I will unblip, Gene. To be in a state of self-control, people need three things. I can post this in the chat for people who want to stay on a little bit longer. People need three things. First is to know what's expected of them. Second is to know how well they're doing in relation to what's expected of them. And third is to know what options or resources or whatever are available to them to do differently. That's the first half of the quote. The second half of the quote is that if any of those three are lacking, a person is not in a state of self-control and can't be held responsible. And think about the workplaces, the organizations, the networks, the projects that you're involved in. I've made it my habit when I do keynotes to companies to ask for a show of hands of how many of you have all three of those in your organization, and never does a hand go up. And I ask how many have two of those in your organization, and maybe, depending on where I am, 10 or 20% of the hands go up, maybe. How many of you have even one of those in your organization? I've never seen more than half the hands go up. And yet we expect things from each other that we can't possibly deliver because we haven't provided that foundation. Geron was speaking in the context of business. I suspect that this conversation, that this framework applies in all the realms that we've been talking about today.